Carrie, it's all yours.
Okay, welcome. I'm Carrie Colanisi, Chair of the Rulemaking Committee, and pleased to welcome everyone today. Our meeting will open with some remarks by Matt Weiner, Executive Director and Vice Chairman, ACUS. Matt?
I think it's on mute, Matt.
Do I say a word or two, or do you take the roll first?
I've got you say some opening remarks, but
All right. Well, I will be brief. We have a lot of members and others on the phone. Looks like we're up to about 50 now, which is very large for an ACUS meeting. I'm sure there'll be no shortage of perspectives and opinions. I'm confident, though, that the committee will reach consensus on meaningful recommendations that will improve the rulemaking process, even if there may be disagreements at times in some first order questions about what the purpose of the public comment process is. Carrie, I have this confidence in part because you are chairing the meetings for this project. Before turning it over to you, I'd just like to thank our, I think, 7 consultants for producing the exemplary report before the committee. ACUS staff members, Danny Shulkin and Mark Thompson, for providing invaluable assistance to our consultants along the way. And not least, our many ACUS members joining today's meeting for giving us their time and expertise. So with that, Carrie, I will turn the meeting back over to you and enjoy.
thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for your continued public service and leadership at ACUS. And now it is time for us to call the roll, and Danny will handle that. What we will do is first, we'll have 2 rolls. The first will be the names of the committee members and alternates for committee members. And after each name is called, if your name is called, please say here, and we'll make sure your mic is working that way, as well as knowing that you're here. So Danny?
Sure. So Carrie, you're up first. Carrie Colanisi.
Here.
James L. Anderson. Gary Bass. Emily Bremer. Alona Cohen. Peter Constantine. Stephen Crowley. Sarah Beardsley.
Here.
Neil Eisner. Andrew Emery.
Here.
Cynthia Farina. Emily Hammond.
Here.
Michael Hertz. Richard Hippolyte. Sally Katzen. Daniel Liebman. Yvonne Schaffer.
Here.
Randolph May.
Here. Here.
Rebecca Orban.
Here.
Nick Perillo. I think I've gone through some of you. So if I'm going too fast to unmute, let me know. Dick Pierce.
Here.
Mitchell Plav.
Here.
David Pritzker.
Here.
William Schlakely.
Here.
Anna Shavers.
Here.
Noel Green.
Here.
Lon Smith.
Here.
Kevin Stack,
Here.
Robert Stone,
Here.
Tom Sussman,
Here.
Miriam Vincent,
Here.
and Adam White.
Here.
Is there anyone that I missed or went too fast when I was calling the roll who didn't get a chance to say something out loud? Michael Hertz, I think I might not have heard you, so I'm gonna go back and add you in there. I'll now say the alternates and other ACUS members. Christina McDonald, Jonathan Doles,
Here.
Amanda Neely, Sarah Beardsley,
Here.
Michael Fitzpatrick, Virginia Huth, Timothy Mullins,
Here.
Robert Hinchman,
Here.
Dan Cohen,
Here. Here.
Doug Klein, Don Mancini,
I'm here.
Leah Mozena,
Here.
Philip Berenbroik, Bridget Dooling,
Here. Good morning.
morning, Jim Tazi.
Here.
That's all.
Is there
Karen?
anyone whose name was called, but you didn't get quick enough to the mic at all?
Neil,
Okay.
Neil Eisner and Nick Perillo, I see you out there. I'm not sure if you can say that you're here or unmute yourself.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear.
Okay.
Great. And Neil Eisner.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, just let me start by reviewing the ground rules for discussion, which may be already quite familiar for those of you who are members of ACUS, but we want to make sure that it's clear to everybody who is joining us today. Only ACUS members, whether or not on the committee and their designated alternates, have full speaking privileges. That said, I don't want to encourage you to keep your mics on just because you have speaking privileges. To avoid background noise, actually, I'd ask that you keep your microphone on mute. And when you would like to speak, either use the Zoom's hand raise feature or put a comment in the chat of Zoom indicating that you'd like to speak. I'll keep a queue and call on you, and then you can unmute yourself. And then when you're finished speaking, if you could remute yourself when you're finished, that would be appreciated. If you are an ACUS member, a designated alternate, we would encourage you when you are speaking, or even when you're not, to use the webcam so we can see each other. When it comes to participants on this online meeting who are not ACUS members or alternates, if you would like to participate, that requires unanimous consent of the committee members. If time permits, I will certainly consider calling on such attendees at appropriate moments. And I'll presume that the committee members consent to your participation unless someone raises an objection. If you would like to participate and you're not an ACUS member, also just use the chat feature to indicate, or the Zoom hand raise function, and wait until I call on you. And again, unmute yourself and remute when you're finished. When it comes to using the chat function, not the fat chunction, I would ask that you just use it for really indicating that you would like to speak. We ask that you do not hold sidebar discussions or put substantive comments in the chat feature. And when it comes to voting, just a reminder that only members of the Rulemaking Committee, which would comprise government members or their alternates, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels, will have a vote. If you don't have a vote, please refrain from voting. It will help us keep track of things better. If you're not sure whether you are a member of the committee or not, let us know. Danny and I have lists, and we can make sure to let you know that. I don't know whether we will have any votes really at all today, this being our first of three-hour meetings, but we will just wanted to note that at the outset for today. We have a terrific consultant report. Several of the authors of this report are here today with us, and several of them are also members of the committee. My understanding is that they are here participating as consultants today, not as committee members. With that, what I'd like to do is actually turn to Reeve Bull, the research director of ACUS, who has agreed to provide us with an overview of the consultant report. Following that overview, what I would like to do is encourage committee members, if you have some clarifying questions for Reeve about the report, or other questions about just the general research that was conducted or the framework that the report provides, we will open that up for questions to Reeve and as appropriate members of the consulting team. And then we will lead into our discussion of the larger problem, the draft recommendation. Just so everybody is kind of aware, my thought is that we will follow on the discussion of the consultant report with a focus on really what are the types of problems that might potentially exist with the three types of comment, mass comments, the computer generated or robo comments, and then the malattributed or fraudulent comments. I don't expect necessarily that we will today go through each and every recommendation. I'd like to try to get some focus, see how far we can get through the recommendations in terms of their wording. But again, remind everybody that we will be back at this for 2 more 3-hour committee meetings. With that, let me turn things over to Reeve and his presentation on the consultant's report.
Reeve, Carrie, before Reeve starts, one of our consultants who's a member of the committee or an ACUS member just asked about voting, whether consultants can vote. The answer is no.
Right. They are here today participating as consultants, not committee members, which means that we will be treating you for both voting purposes and conversation or participation purposes as a non-member. But of course, I want to say that my aim and hope is that we can have a full, robust discussion, and certainly as appropriate and as in any case where a consultant can lend insight or value to the conversation, I will certainly welcome that. But in terms of voting, no, you wouldn't vote. Okay, Reeve then.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. And thanks to all of you for attending today. I will be very brief. Hopefully you've all had a chance to review the report. And so I just want to hit a few of the highlights. Let me start though, since several of the co-consultants, as Carrie and Matt have mentioned, are also members of the committee or members of ACUS, even though they're recused from voting today, and a few of them are not able to attend. Let me just give a quick shout out to the other members of the team. So in addition to myself, the team includes Mike Livermore, Bridget Dooling, Michael Hertz, Emily Hammond, Steve Bala, and Beth Novak. And the virtue, I think, of having a large group like this, which is something that's somewhat unique. We've had multiple consultants on reports before, but I think this is probably the largest group we've had. Is you get a variety of views, and I think this was a really robust process because of this. I also want to thank Mark Thompson and Danny Shulkin. It was a real benefit to have multiple consultants, but also a bit of a challenge to sort of pull together multiple different pieces. And Mark and Danny did fantastic work there, so thanks to them as well. So let me just briefly describe first the research that we did in connection with the report. So part of it, of course, was a literature review, and many of you today have written on this topic. It's a very robust literature. So we went through a lot of different law review articles, as well as reports and other resources on this issue of both the purposes of the notice and comment process, and then particularly what issues technologies have created. And then in addition to that, we did interviews with multiple different agencies. A lot of the agencies are the ones you would think of that have a very robust rulemaking process, EPA, FCC, CFPB, DOT, and so forth. That input was extremely valuable. We also did an interagency roundtable on the topic to get additional input, which was, I think, also quite valuable in the sense that we also wanted to hear from agencies that don't necessarily do a lot of rulemaking. And so that was an opportunity to get their perspective as well. So I think the overall report reflects a variety of views from a variety of different agencies and sort of how they grappled with some of these topics. I think one of the overarching themes of the report and our findings is that technology certainly magnifies and is continuing to magnify some of the challenges associated with the notice and comment process. You basically move from a paper process to an online process, which certainly lowers the barrier to entry and makes it much easier to file comments. And it's an issue that we at ACUS have been mindful of for a while now. We did a forum back in 2018 on the topic. I'm actually delighted Don Mancini is able to join us today. He was our keynote speaker at that forum. And he at the time, as well as others, highlighted that though this is raising some issues, at least at the time, it wasn't sort of an overwhelming problem for agencies. Certainly they've dealt with mass comments before. That goes all the way back to the paper process. People would submit postcard campaigns and the like. And with respect to fraudulent comments or malattributed comments and computer-generated comments, at the time, those were really relatively new. Since that time, there's been increasing interest in the process, probably a lot of it driven by the FCC net neutrality rule, where you got just a massive response and a lot of malattributed and computer-generated comments. A permanent subcommittee on investigations on the Hill did a report on this issue and highlighted some of the issues they saw. The e-rulemaking program at GSA, with whom we've also closely coordinated with this process, did an event about a year ago where I and Steve and I think several of us spoke that also highlighted some of the issues that became increasingly sort of salient in the last several years. And sort of the overall takeaway, I think, is, over the last 3 or 4 years, it's become a larger issue than it was. The technologies continue to evolve. Agencies have continued to track the problem. And, it's becoming increasingly salient. So part of the purposes of our interviews was to try to get a sense of how salient is it, how big of a problem is it for agencies, and what are some approaches that they've taken to address it, to grapple with it. And I think I think this is a fair summarization of the report. I think one of the findings is, though it is an increasingly salient issue, it's one that's still relatively manageable on the part of the agencies. Mass comments are probably more common than they were, but the vast majority of rulemakings do not get a mass comment response, do not have any sort of mass comment campaign associated with it. And to the extent that there is a mass comment campaign, as we define it, which is where an outside organization encourages members to submit identical or nearly identical comments, there are software programs in place that help to address that, deduplication software, where agencies can identify comments that are identical or nearly identical and treat them accordingly. And then with respect to computer-generated and malattributed comments, the takeaway was, though, that is a problem, it's relatively rare. There are relatively few instances of documented computer-generated comments or malattributed comments in rulemakings. However, it's an issue that agencies are increasingly concerned by, because as the technology evolves and becomes more sophisticated, in the computer-generated arena particularly, it seems like there's an increased risk that a bot, a computer, could actually submit a comment that's as sophisticated as a comment a human being would generate, and is difficult to distinguish from a human comment. One other key takeaway is that though technology has certainly magnified these problems, technology is also a big part of the solution. So I mentioned deduplication software. Agencies are increasingly experimenting with natural language processing and other types of software that help them process comments. And then technology also opens new opportunities. So, there's obviously an increasing focus, especially in the Biden administration in the last few months, on ways to reach disadvantaged communities or communities who not previously had as great an opportunity to participate in the process. And technology can really facilitate that as well. So, there are drawbacks associated with technology, but there are also new opportunities associated with evolving technology. To sort of just briefly then summarize sort of where we came down then in terms of recommendations. So really a major focus is on transparency. We've explicitly avoided taking a position on the extent to which agencies ever should take into account public opinion in the process. I know Dick Pierce has filed a comment on that today, and I think that'll be an interesting part of the discussion. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of agencies from our interviews definitely agreed that the process is not a plebiscite, nor are public comments representative of public opinion necessarily. But there were a handful of instances where they said it might be, it might matter with respect to the political perception of the rule or other aspects. So we intentionally avoided taking any issue one way or the other on that. And our recommendations are really focused primarily on transparency, in the sense that regardless of what position the agency takes, it should clearly communicate that to the public. And it should try to make the process, it should try to facilitate the process to the greatest extent possible. So if the agency really is only interested in technical views, then they should make that clear, and should try to structure the rule in a way that maximizes the probability that they'll get that sort of input. And then we also try to highlight, at least initially, some of the ways that new technology might enhance the process. We don't necessarily recommend that agencies do specific things because this technology is still evolving. But the last section of the report really highlights some new and exciting opportunities for agencies to use technologies in new and innovative ways. And we recommend that agencies, at least be mindful of these opportunities and consider, whether any of them might make sense in connection with their rulemaking practices. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Carrie.
Okay, thank you very much, Reeve, for that overview. What I'd like to do is invite any committee members or other ACUS members who have questions of clarification about the report that they would like to address to Reeve, or any of the consultants, that we certainly get those clarifications made. And then we'll turn to just some general discussion about these issues. But let's first ask if anybody has specific clarifying questions for Reeve or the consultants about their report. Okay.
Carrie, I put a comment in chat. I don't know if you saw it.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Sure. Yeah, I don't have any criticism of the committee's work and any concern about their recommendations, but I do think that it's a mistake not to address explicitly this question of what is the purpose of notice and comment rulemaking, and what is the purpose of comments. The only reason these three problem areas exist is because of the widespread belief of many members of the public that this process is a plebiscite and that it is considered to be a plebiscite. And I think it's very important for us to say, first, as a normative matter, it should not be considered a plebiscite. There is no defensible means through which it can be used as a plebiscite. Second, as I listened to Reeve, that as a positive matter, the vast majority of agencies do not use it as a plebiscite. And then to make clear what it is and why it is very helpful to agencies in terms of improving the quality of the rules that they issue. I think it's a mistake to avoid that. I understand there's a political hornet's nest there. I've addressed this issue several times on National Public Radio, and I got tremendous pushback from people saying, "Oh, no, this is all about the..." And I just think that makes it even more important that we, who are supposed to be educating and assisting agencies and the public in this understanding this area of law, that we be clear and transparent about what rulemaking is and what rulemaking is not and cannot be.
Okay. That, I take it that's not a clarifying question as much as it's a statement, which is fine and it's a nice segue into what I really hope we can start with. But before we build on that, Dick, I just wanted to see if there were any clarifying questions that anybody had on the report or for the consultants. Okay, so thank you very much, Dick, for that. I think it's a nice way of starting this discussion. Normally, I find that it's helpful for committees to start with the draft recommendations themselves and really dig into those before turning to the preamble. And I still think we shouldn't wordsmith the preamble yet, but I do want to turn to part of the preamble as a way of framing some initial discussion along the lines, certainly, of what Dick has teed up for us here. And I do note that the preamble's second sentence says that the draft preamble, second sentence says that, commenting on rules and rulemaking is not a plebiscite. But I want to also turn to page 2 just to highlight what the draft recommendation says are some of the potential problems. And maybe that wording is important to keep in mind here too, and urge the committee to engage in some discussion and joint exploration of what are the potential problems. And I highlight it toward the middle of the page, starting on about line 30, the draft recommendation indicates that there's three potential problems that can be associated with any of these phenomena: the mass comments, the computer generated comments, or the malattributed comments. And in that paragraph at line 30 there, one is it just can make it difficult for agencies to extract and synthesize useful information, presumably because there's a lot of other chaff there that you have to separate to find the wheat. Second, that they can tax agencies' resources just to do that kind of processing. It can be costly and time consuming. And third, that it might harm public perceptions about the legitimacy of particular rules in the rulemaking process as a whole. And then this draft recommendation further in the next paragraph says that each of these three phenomena may have their own separate or distinctive problems. With respect to mass commenting on line 36, the potential problem is described as having to process large numbers of comments that are only slightly different. The next page then at the top, for the computer generated comments, a potential problem is that it may present legal issues in light of the APA stipulation that only interested persons are due an opportunity to comment. And then there's a practical concern that it may be difficult for agencies to distinguish those computer generated comments from those submitted by humans. And then lastly, for the malattributed comments, line 41, a potential problem is that these may mislead agencies, harm the people whose identities are misappropriated, and perhaps raise some legal issues. Now, I don't want to necessarily delve into wordsmithing these at this stage, but I highlighted these just to see if members of the committee agree that these are all potential problems, and B, are there other potential problems that are not included in this list in the draft recommendation preamble that you think we ought to consider? My thought is, especially because there are these three separate but related phenomenon of mass comments, computer generated comments, and malattributed comments, before we turn to actually looking at the recommendations, we might benefit from fleshing out exactly what the problems are that the recommendations ought to aim to try to solve or otherwise address. So let me invite any further comments. I think Dick has gotten us off to a good start. I take it in sort of suggesting that these three phenomena may be themselves indicative of another problem, which would be misperceptions by the public or by advocacy groups about the role of commenting. And or encourage others to raise your hand or put something in the chat to indicate you'd like to participate. Okay, Lon.
Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes, you're good. And Danny, maybe I don't know that we need to look at the text, but let's be ready to do that. Again, because my aim here is not to have us necessarily wordsmith this, but just speak openly and kind of get a sense for the committee as whether we think these are the right problems. So go ahead, Lon.
these may be actual problems rather than potential problems, but let me put it in context. Suppose you have one comment, it's a good comment that you consider, but it comes in 10 different slight variations, and let's say each variation there's 1,000 different, 1,000 comments. You got 10,000 comments. So the question that I have, three questions. Which of these go into the administrative record for litigation purposes? The second is, which ones go into the administrative file under the requirements of the Archives and Records Administration? And which ones have to go to a requester under a FOIA request?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that the recommendation, I think that you have to start with Richard's comment that you have to decide, there should be a clear statement that you only put, it's only the ones that are considered. But even when you have the ones that are considered, how do you answer those questions? I don't know the answer to those.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so those are some different problems with sort of the what might be some legal uncertainty about what the answers are to those questions. Okay, thank you, Lon. Randy?
Thank you, Carrie, and hello, everyone. I'll just note quickly, I have my ACUS cup here, mug from 2010 that we received in one of the first plenary sessions after the reinstitution. So I never brought it down physically, but it's easy here. So that said,
Randy, we recall those cups. They're highly toxic.
Oh God. Okay. Well, I've got a glass I'll use for the rest of this. So, I preface this, or it's actually an important part of what I would say. I've been involved closely in the FCC rulemakings involving net neutrality as a comment submitter, and actually in the last iteration, the Free State Foundation's comment, I submitted them on behalf of the Free State Foundation. We were cited actually 50 different times. So the commission thankfully read our comments. But, so I'm familiar with this problem or issue, question at the FCC. And so based on that experience, I just want to generally now say that I have some sympathy for Richard Pierce's concern. I'm not quite sure how to address it or the extent to which it needs further addressing, but it is a concern of mine. And I do recall, and the reason it's a concern is that I'm fairly certain that there were commissioners, or at least one commissioner, and I think more at different times during the iterations, the two different rulemaking proceedings, or maybe three, when comments were sought, which said things that encouraged persons to submit comments, which of course is perfectly not only acceptable, but fine, but they did it in a way that implied that, in fact, the number of comments was going to be relevant ultimately to the FCC's decision, and that there was going to be some counting of comments. I don't know whether, I apologize, I haven't read all of the background report. I don't know whether those comments from commissioners made it into the report or were part of the report. But if that's true, then it does sort of go to the extent to which the public begins to perceive just the sheer number of comments filed as an important element of the commission's ultimate decision, or should be. But I appreciate everything Carrie said in the report, and I know it doesn't. I understand that, and I'm not exactly sure what more would be said, or how Dick, when we get to that point, what he would really propose. And it might just be something that's possibly fairly minor, but I am sympathetic with the concern that the report ultimately not be somehow seen or distorted into something that could be read as inviting plebiscites that are seen as important elements of a decision-making process. Thanks, Gary.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Any other committee member or ACUS member have comments about the underlying problem, actual or potential? That Neil, go ahead.
Neil, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, you're still muted.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Okay. I agree with both sides of the issue here. We want the public to talk to us and tell us what their views are. But we also have to rely on factual information that supports the decision we want to make in the end. It doesn't matter whether we have 100,000 votes for and one against, if the only one giving us data that we made a mistake in the proposal is the one. People think that if 1,000 people come in and tell us that we should do something, and only one person says we shouldn't do it, they should win because they've got the most votes. My old department, we regulated almost 8 to 9 million truck drivers, 400,000 trucking companies. We also had foreign companies to consider, Canadian drivers, Mexican drivers. So it doesn't matter if you're 100,000 of them or 200,000 of them, they don't necessarily represent the 8 million or the 9 million. But I think we need to discuss this. I read the first paragraph and I said, why do we have two sentences saying the same thing about the fact that it's not a vote? It's important information that we need to have that tells us whether it's going to work or not work. And I think we probably do need, as Richard Pierce said, to discuss this a little bit more so people will understand it's not just something we do, it's something we have to do under the statute.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Let me just pose a question, maybe to spark some more discussion along these lines. And the question would be, are there no circumstances under which the number of comments might be relevant? For example, if an agency is regulating truck drivers and gets overwhelming opposition to rule, might that be informative, for example, of some compliance challenges that might arise down the road? And I raise that just to think about whether we as ACUS want to be in the position of saying that we, or even being construed or misconstrued as saying we want to discourage the public from commenting when it might not be evident both to us right now nor to the individual commenters what the information value might be of comments that are filed. I mean, maybe that in some circumstances could be potentially relevant information for an agency. Does anybody want to respond to that or take us? Nick, you have your hand up, and I also would just ask Neil Eisner and Randy May if you could mute your microphones. That would probably be helpful too when you're finished speaking. If everybody could do that, I'd appreciate it. Nick?
Thank you, Carrie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks. I mean, a distinction made by a lot of scholars who've worked on this, including some of the people who worked on the report, is a distinction between the provision of information that would be useful for instrumental reasoning by the agency, for end-to-means reasoning, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the mere expression of value judgments. And I suppose you could have a mass comment campaign. I mean, even a campaign where people submit large numbers of identical comments, but if all of them are providing information, like if they're airline passengers and they're all saying that they've had the same recurring problem with air travel or something like that, then that is information that could be useful in instrumental reasoning by the agency. Now, I mean, it's not a scientific survey, but still, it could be some kind of useful information. It's not just the expression of value judgments. So, and then Carrie, I think the example you gave about how, what if there's a mass comment campaign by a very large number of regulated parties just expressing a value judgment against the rule, would that signal to the agency that there would be compliance problems? And I think that's an example of how, even if you have mass expression of a value judgment, if the agency is relying to some degree on voluntary compliance because on the premise that regulated parties are going to have buy-in to the rule, then the mere existence of a large number of regulated parties with value judgments in one direction actually is information that would be relevant to the agency from the perspective of instrumental reasoning. So I mean, I don't know that it's the number of comments or the identicalness of all the comments. It's the idea that the comments, are simply express themselves as votes. We should do this. I think we should do this. And, I'm, a person, I'm a voter, I'm an American citizen or whatever. And so you should listen to me, as opposed to, I'm a regulated party, I'm a regulatory beneficiary, and I have some information, that is useful for the agency's instrumental reasoning. I think perhaps that distinction, which is one made by Cynthia Farina and a lot of other people in this area, is one that that may need to be considered.
Thank you very much, Nick. I have Virginia who has a comment in the chat, but I'd actually like to encourage her to make it on the video and discourage everybody, or remind everybody that we want to discourage you from making the substantive comments in the chat. So Virginia, you're next. If you could share your comment.
Yes, I was going to make the same point as Nicholas. I'm Virginia Hughes. I'm with the General Services Administration, and I'm currently overseeing the e-rulemaking program at GSA. And I also have prior experience. I worked at the Office of Management and Budget for a number of years in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And there is precedent and history consistent with what Mr. Prios stated, that, while it's not a plebiscite, the volume of comments could also convey information to an agency that it didn't have before about the impact on a particular constituency, and therefore provide value to the agency about its decision-making process. But it is definitely not a plebiscite. So.
Great, thank you very much, Virginia. Lon, you had your hand up. Did you have something further you wanted to say?
Yeah, just to answer your question, the only time that I ever thought that a number of comments might mean something is when I issued an NPRM and I got no comments, because I didn't know whether people agreed. I didn't know whether people didn't care. And I didn't know whether later on, if I issued a final regulation, whether that, and somebody challenged it, whether that would be relevant to the court, saying, hey, nobody complained, nobody said anything about it. They seemed to agree. So it was only in that direction that I thought that the number of comments make a difference. Other than that, no, it was the content of the comments.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Unmute yourself. There we go. Thanks.
I think the way I would go about it, if I had to make the decision, is to have a discussion of it rather than to have you must do this, you must do that. For example, I had a former general counsel call me one day to talk about the proposed rule. And I said, are you going to comment to our docket? He says, no, because I like what you're doing, so there's no need for me to comment to the docket. I said, you need to comment because we need to have the record reflecting your concern, your support of it. If others are going to come in and argue we shouldn't do it and you think we should. And he didn't comment. Again, probably didn't have the time, so I don't blame him. But you've got all sorts of problems with what people think the docket is for and what they think the comments are for. And there are good reasons for concluding as we would. We've got 1,000 people saying X. They gave us no support for X, no data on it, but there are 1,000 people out there who don't like it. But then experts will tell you that they like being heard. Even if they don't win the battle, they at least got heard by the government. So that's another reason for encouraging people to do it. I think all these things can be discussed. And basically, it comes to a particular case and what we need to do in that particular case. In other words, we may want to consider that the number of comments is going to make it hard to enforce the rule, even though they don't have any good reasons for not doing it. We need to hear those things.
Right. So I hear you saying, Neil, that we need to be a little bit cautious that the ACUS recommendation doesn't necessarily signal that any member of the public should self-censor if they wish to file a comment. They should do so, even if it is identical to someone else's, perhaps. Is that fair?
That's fair, but I take it a step further. I think that's a very good point. But you need to express to these people, the more data you can give us, the better we can do in writing a rule that will withstand court challenge. So it's important to know why you object, not just that you object, or why you support it. And if you can tell us that you drive at night and you feel it's a lot safer driving your truck at night, even if you don't have any data, that's important to know.
That's very helpful. And it follows on and I think builds on Lon's point about where he gets zero comments, that's sometimes perhaps the most troublesome of all situation. I'm hearing then perhaps another problem that's not necessarily reflected here. It's not so much the problem perhaps with mass comments or computer generated comments or fraudulent comments as much as a lack of substantive, informative, meaningful comments that maybe we ought to also put on the table here and query whether that's within the scope of the mandate here for this particular recommendation, but I think it's certainly related concern to be sure. Andrew Emery.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think both points are correct in the sense that it's not a vote, but it's certainly not a vote, and I don't think it helps a lot when the agency gets tons of duplicate comments. But the fact of the matter is the agency is making a policy decision, and of course, depending on the statute, is how much discretion the agency has. If the agency has little discretion, then lots of comments, saying something that's contrary to discretion is not helpful. But it is a policy choice, and a lot of the policy decisions are made based on what risks the population is willing to take. And often an agency will say, well, we want to perhaps make something prohibit something because there's only a few dozen people doing it, and they're only doing it for these two reasons, and it's not safe. To find out that there are 10,000 people who actually do this thing for a third reason, that's helpful. And knowing that there are 10,000 versus 10 is helpful for the agency to know. Again, it's not a vote, doesn't mean the agency has to listen to them. So I think it's certainly, it's definitely not a vote. I think that's a true statement. But knowing how many people view something and how many people support something or what their views are, and that there's this population out there doing something for reasons you weren't even aware of or different purpose. I mean, it's just, it's useful information and it's useful, valuable data.
All right, thank you. And can I build on that and make just to at least toss out an idea that a theme here that the problems we might want to think about that link these phenomena of mass computer generated and fraudulent comments is that there's a desire and a need and an obligation on the part of the agency to gather information and to make informed decisions. And that it's more difficult for the agency to glean that information if they have, in some cases, it may be more difficult simply because of the volume of the information, volume of the comments. But of course, as Andrew has said and others have suggested, sometimes that might be, well, informative itself. So we certainly wouldn't want to necessarily, it sounds like, perhaps discourage large volumes of comments. But large volumes of comments do, though, necessarily generate some greater demands on the agency's time and resources to process. And similarly, computer-generated comments may be less informative for the reasons that Andrew was saying, if indeed you don't have genuinely 10,000 genuine comments. It might not indicate how the rule would be carried out or whether there's an alternative that people would prefer that might be more effective. And the fraudulent comments may, again, if they're misattributed to truck drivers, for example, and then again, the information, each of these phenomenon in some ways can, either because of the difficulty of processing or the difficulty of attribution to people who have knowledge or have some connection with the rule, because they're either comments that are generated by computer or generated in a fraudulent manner, that these can undermine the kind of purpose of making informed decisions that commenting is supposed to fulfill. Let me just put that out there as an overarching theme then that might link these three phenomenon and help inform our own thinking as a committee about what the nature of the problem that our recommendations ought to try to help address. Randy?
Thank you, Carrie. Just one second here. I still don't know exactly whether I would want to change the recommendations themselves in some way, but just I want to just give an example of what I was referring to earlier regarding why I share some of Dick Pierce's concern. And I think what he was getting at, and maybe there would be a way to say this in the right way at some point when we get to it, but I want to read just this brief statement from Commissioner Rosenworcel, who's now actually the acting chair at the FCC. This was something issued the last time the commission took comments in the net neutrality proceeding after the DC Circuit's court remand. So the commissioner said, "Today, the FCC is seeking comment on how best to move forward. My advice, the American public should raise their voices and let Washington know how important an open internet is for every piece of our civic and commercial lives. The agency wrongfully gave broadband providers the power to block websites, throttle services, and censor online content. The fight for an open internet is not over. It's time to make noise. It's time to make noise." I think every part of her statement is, of course, perfectly fine and reflects her substantive view about the net neutrality rulemaking as a matter of substance. But when you get to the very end and she says it's time to make noise, I think that it's sort of that tenor. And there have been other statements like that where I think it tends to create a perception, if it's not countered sometimes, that the rulemaking process ultimately is a plebiscite if what you're doing is making noise as opposed to submitting comments that are informative, and it's not just a poll. So I think that's a basis for, a concern that I have that we'll have to wrestle with, I think, as we go through this process. Thanks, Gary.
Okay, thank you, Randy. And I think the idea of noise is consistent with that, to search for information. We want to get the signal more than the noise. The question is, I think Nick was raising this, at least what I heard from Nick might be reframed as saying that sometimes the noise can provide a signal. If it is related to some kind of instrumental purpose or challenge that the rule faces. What I think might be useful at this point in time, unless there's some other general comments on the nature of the problem, would be to turn to the draft recommendations now and go through them and have some discussion. And if we want to, think about wordsmithing some of these at this point in time, I'm perfectly open to them. But on page 4, and thank you, Danny, for putting up this. I think that we should look at these recommendations, and then we will come back to the preamble once we have recommendations in mind and make sure that the preamble is fitting this. Obviously, that would be what I would suggest we do. If there's other thoughts on the committee, certainly please feel free to comment on that approach. But the first, if there are no comments on that, then the first approach, draft recommendation here under this approach would be to look at line 59. Agencies should continue to, or if they have not already, begin to utilize deduplication software to identify the unique content in submitted comments. Now, I read that as a recommendation that is targeting toward the mass comment phenomenon, the mass identical comment. This is a way of addressing the problem of the resource demands on agencies to extract the signal from the mass content. Does anybody have any comments on that recommendation in its current draft form? Emily.
So when we did our recommendation on legal considerations in e-rulemaking, one thing that the committee thought was important then was to include the word reliable in its corresponding recommendation to use deduplication software. And I think that, I haven't looked at the recommendation recently, but I'm pretty sure that's in there. I'm wondering if we should mirror that language from, I think it's 2011-1, and note that it should be reliable software.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe before deduplication, we can insert the word reliable. One question I have, and this may be best addressed by some of our government members, perhaps. If most rules, or all rules at an agency are generating a few dozen comments, for example, will this recommendation fit for all agencies? It somehow suggests that all agencies, it's implied at least, but is there really a need for deduplication software for an agency that does 2 rules a year and doesn't receive more than a few dozen comments?
I'll make a
And does that
suggestion.
matter? Virginia, yeah, go ahead.
Again, maybe the wording of should have access to such deduplication software might address that, because yes, there, I don't have the data at my fingertips, but I have it somewhere. The mass commenting applies really to a small fraction of the total rulemakings. It is useful for everybody, but there's many agencies that they just get a handful of comments. The vast majority of rules, probably 95% of rules, get very few comments. So access, perhaps the word access to such technology might address that.
Then, do we need the parenthetical at this point? Rebecca, please join us.
Yes, thank you. Not sure. Oh, there I am. Sorry. I just wondered if there's anyone on the call who can speak to the availability of these tools in the e-rulemaking system. My understanding is they're not available right now, or limited availability after the GSA move, and they won't be available until next year sometime. So maybe I'm not up to speed on all of that. Maybe there's someone who knows more. Go ahead.
I'm the person. Yeah, so as you mentioned, the e-rulemaking system, this is probably familiar to everybody, but just in case, I'll just do a quick recap. October 1st, 2019, the e-rulemaking program was moved over to GSA. We stood up a new office. I oversee that office. Some of the original staff are still there, Tobias Schrader and so forth, moved over from EPA. At the time GSA took it over, it was a pretty troubled system. And it was on FDMS version 4. That's the agency backend. It was end of life for Adobe Flash. Within a year, the software browser had to be replaced or the system would have gone dark. There were a number of other concerns, security issues. Basically, the agency had to work, and within a year was able to stand up version 5, FDMS version 5, replacing the Adobe Flash software interface, but basically having to build a new system from scratch in order to avoid the end of life issues. In the course of doing so, we've had to establish a minimum viable product for the agencies because we just, we don't only had so much time and money. And, none of this was budgeted for when the transfer took place. So right now, we've actually begun to develop, again, the minimum viable product. So you've got quite a bit of work done. The deduplication has been one of the hardest things to replace. Basically, it's almost $1 million to rebuild that deduplication tool as it was, and we simply haven't had the funding. We've been, and there's some other core services we've had to provide, just basic docket management services, bulk extract. There's a whole host of other things, and we've been working with e-rulemaking agencies to prioritize those functions. And I can tell you deduplication is a high priority for them, but simply having access to a docket system is even higher. So we've been doing all that we can, and I have to say I'm very proud of the fact we've been able to, take an end-of-life system and basically ensure continuity of services to the partner agencies. Right now, we're still on even though we rebuilt it, it's still on an aging monolithic legacy system that is very costly to build on. We have requested modernization funding in the president's budget for FY22. It's currently in the budget request to the Congress. Only the top line has been released, but our funding request is in that budget to modernize. And so right now we are sort of between, a rock and a hard place. We need to continue maintenance and continue to develop the current legacy system to ensure our agency needs are met. And at the same time, we're hopeful that we can really do a fresh start, assuming the funding gets through Congress, so that we can actually build a really good deduplication tool. And in fact, we'd like to go even beyond and potentially use artificial intelligence or other technologies to really help us discern meaning and, look at syntax, look at really ways to extract value going beyond the deduplication approach that we have now, which is basic. What we're offering now to our agencies is not even the deduplication tool that we were able to offer previously, which was still what I'd call basic, but it's sort of a manual workaround. We, again, recognizing the critical need to our agencies, we're basically extracting the comments, exporting them into Excel and providing some other sorts and filters and things to be able to give, a download of data that's sorted so that agencies can use that to help them with their deduplication process. But it's still sort of, a kludgy, semi-tech, semi-manual workaround that we're relying on to make sure our agencies get what they, can need to get the job done. Right now, I think we'll be able to build back the deduplication function as it was sometime in the spring of next year when we get a little bit more funding starting in the next fiscal year. But again, that's still going to be basically building it as it was before, which is going to be, let's say, good, better than what it was. But, in our minds, it's still not really an optimal tool when you were talking about the challenges you've raised in terms of really assessing millions of comments. And I should add, the kind of tool that we would like to explore in a truly modernized environment uses data analytics tools, not just to assess comments, but to access and to review rulemakings themselves, to really look at cross domains at regulatory content, looking at opportunities for synergies or perhaps duplication or contradiction, looking at opportunities to streamline regulations. There are some technologies out there that really, they rely on ontologies. It's sort of a way of mapping the whole data structure in the rulemaking to help you generate compliance and enforcement systems. So there's a whole new world that we're hoping to explore should funding come in. I should add that the modernization we're hoping for would really be a 4-year program. And so, right now we're, we haven't seen the money. We'll have to see what Congress says. We'll have to see if we get continued funding. So this is all very, long-term goals and aspirational. But back to your question, in the short term, deduplication is not what it should be, but we are doing our best to not only bring it back to what it was, but to really take it all to the very next level using state-of-the-art technology.
Thank you. So that actually, and I think the edits address my concern, which will come up in some of the other recommendations as well, which is that the agency using the docket may not actually have control over whether that feature is available, right? So this should have access to, works fine, because I think we all agree we should, but things like should utilize or should use, we just don't have the options all the time. So thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, Dick Pierce.
In light of Rebecca and Virginia's really extraordinarily helpful information, what I suggest is that we return to use, but then add 2 qualifications. One that would say something like in rulemakings in which there is reason for concern about the 3 phenomena that we're addressing, and then the second qualification is when it becomes available, because we obviously can't urge people to use something that does not exist, and who knows what Congress is going to do.
Well, I just say that it's kind of hard to, I think this is where just very general language, I sort of feel like the deduplication is probably sufficient. I mean, to try to specify in more detail, I mean, maybe what you want to do, and I'm sort of want to be cautious here because I don't want to put myself in a bind either in terms of what we end up delivering, right? I mean, we want to do our very best, but again, I'm not exactly sure the shape, scope. I don't know if funding will be available. I don't even know if we're going to get our money, to do this, but, maybe something aspirational about outcomes, about the ability to, discern, to better discern meaning or uh, predict outcome. I don't know. I'm going to turn that back over to you guys.
Well, it might be to, extract valuable or meaningful information from public comments, especially in cases of mass comments or where there are numerous computer generated or malattributed comments.
Meaningful information is good. Yeah.
That agencies should seek maybe access to reliable deduplication software. And I think in some ways that to signal that it needs to be deduplication software to identify unique content is sort of first generation level functionality, right? To just sort out and identify the, you're suggesting though that, the technology may be improving and we could do other things.
Maybe
and
just
so,
something new technologies or
I mean, maybe, appropriate software or technology rather than even limiting it just to deduplication, because this recommendation will, could, if it says deduplication in 5 years from now, like there's something much better than deduplication, would think that the spirit of the recommendation ought to still apply. Emily?
So tying together a few things that I'm hearing here, I appreciate that all of our recommendations are sort of, their implementation is subject to things like whether the agency has the funding and the resources and what have you. And I also do think we should be sensitive, especially in a recommendation that's so technology focused, to the fact that things evolve, right? Funding evolves and resources evolve and technology evolves. And so I'm wondering if there's a way for us to acknowledge some of these, I think, always present background considerations in the preamble, and then focus our attention in the recommendations on identifying what we think are the best practices. Because I think it takes away from the punch of the recommendations when we frequently reiterate those sort of background limitations that I think everyone always understands. So if we need to include them, I think they should probably be in the preamble, and then we can really focus our attention on making the recommendations a good articulation of best practices.
I think you're right. We certainly don't need to have a preamble built into every recommendation, essentially, is along those lines. Do you think, Emily, that the way Danny has started to write up some changes to that first recommendation, that we're venturing into that realm?
Sorry, I didn't have the red line up. I can only have one thing at a time. Okay. Maybe.
Okay. Any other comments on some of these red line? Can everybody see the red line on your screen? If there's no other comments, then let's move to number 2. This doesn't mean that we should think that our red line version of 1 is final. We will have another meeting and we may be able, if time permitting, obviously we would want to go through and perhaps fine tune these if needed. But let's move to number 2. Agencies should publish policies regarding the posting of duplicate and near identical comments. These policies should balance concerns including user friendliness, transparency, and informational completeness. Agencies should consider including different approaches in their duplication policies, including the options listed there. Those options include posting a single representative example with the count of the duplicates received and an option to view all comments. Break out and post non-identical content. Ask people and entities orchestrating mass comment campaigns to submit a single comment with multiple signatures rather than duplicate comments, and provide enhanced search options based on the unique information content of comments. Now, some of these, and maybe this is an invitation to Virginia to help edify us some more, and it's along the lines, I think, of this kind of questions that Rebecca was raising. Some of these options presumably would need to be options that are available through regulations.gov or the FDMS for agencies, as opposed to and is it customizable for agencies to develop different approaches with those different options?
So yeah, I'll try to tackle it. I first I'll say that, you know, as a, you know, representing e-rulemaking, you know, we're a system, a program management office, and it's our goal to support the requirements of our agencies as they discern them to us. So I don't make policy for how agencies handle comments or anything like that. That's entirely up to the agencies. But we do want to provide a system that supports their needs. So, for example, if it says agencies should consider posting a single representative example with the count, that is entirely up to the agency's discretion. And yes, our, you know, system will support that. They can post whatever they want, however they want it. You know, that's simply up to them. Break out and post non-identical content. Again, it's up to them. I mean, there's a workload issue there on part of the agencies. And so, again, I would want agencies to speak on that. I mean, our system can support that. It's just more, I don't know, server space, right? C, ask people and entities orchestrating mass comment campaigns to submit a single comment with multiple signatures. Again, I know from our agencies, they have very differing views on this. And I would defer to the agencies, and just again, without making a policy recommendation on this area, because again, that's not my role. I think the previous discussion about the value of individuals and so forth versus an organization applies here as well. That sometimes it, you know, you don't necessarily want to discourage individuals, and not everybody has the ability to have an organization behind them. You know, I'll say the technology, assuming it's working, and right now we're in a rough spot, we can intake as many comments, you know, I mean, we can throttle it up. It's not a lack of ability to take them in. It's the ability to sort them right now that's more of an issue. Mm-hmm. And again, I would, you know, and the technology to better manage that is kind of on the horizon. So as we talk about telling agencies they should get better access to things to handle mass volumes of information, and at the same time say you should tell people to send in fewer comments, it seems a little bit contradictory to me. So I would just make that observation. You know, which way do you want it? And again, without really recognizing that I cannot speak on the part of the agencies, I do know that very many agencies are just fine with letting people submit their comments. They're just, you know, again, they'll tell you the mass comment issue does happen, but it's fairly limited. It's just that when it does happen, it's a tsunami, right? But the vast majority of regulations, perhaps 95%, are not getting this mass volume of comments. And so again, but this again, I'd leave to the agencies. I'm sorry, that was a long
Right.
answer.
No, but that may also, going back to our conversation about the first recommendation, the emphasis on access rather than use.
Yeah.
Because if it's not necessary for an agency, they don't have a mass comment rulemaking except once in every 10, 20 years, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, what did I interrupt you, Virginia?
No, I just was going to touch on D. I'm sorry. Let's see. Provide enhanced search options based on the unique information content of comments. I think that sort of relates to the text in number 1, right? It's that ability to have access. So maybe that actually would be combined with number 1 if you were asking my idea as a sort of editorial. So I hope I covered that for you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Dom, sorry to interrupt you from your relaxing time on the beach there. Glad you could join us.
Yeah, after I saw that I forgot to change my background, I'm like, oh, this group will appreciate that.
Yeah, we do. Definitely.
One is like, I will, I think this generally is great, the consideration of this issue. I wanted to make one small comment on 2C, and also maybe a more philosophical comment that's consistent with Virginia's about, we do, and they're related. So we do leave a lot of these to the discretion of the agencies. They have to defend their rules and their consideration of comments under the APA in court, right? So for the most part, we haven't, and I'll just speak for myself and maybe a career Irish staff that we do like to leave the agency some freedom for consideration of comments. But as probably many of you know, we did make a technological change to e-rulemaking that is relevant here, which is, and I'm not sure if this came up in my absence, I've been in and out of the meeting, but I think in February, right, Virginia, we made the beta version of the e-rulemaking, the actual version. And we can talk about reCAPTCHA a little bit later if people want to, but also, organizations now submitting bulk comments on behalf of their constituencies. We use the word loosely because I know a lot of lawyers here. They need to get an API, and so there is a more controlled way of kind of submitting organizations submitting mass comments on their constituency. So there is a little bit more control than there used to be over this. Now, I know that introduces a lot of things. It doesn't answer the questions about individual bulk commenting campaigns where people are asked to submit individually. But I will also mention that if they are asked to submit individually, they have to go through the reCAPTCHA, there's a little bit more control in the system now on mass commenting, and the API includes a verification process. So we do feel like but within that, at least now, and this is topic for the discussion, the conversation, we don't for 2C, I don't think we have made a position about, I think with the API there, they can submit them individually. It seems efficient, and it would still be kind of an individual, looks like an individual generated comment, but we would know exactly where it's coming from. So we did not go down the road of asking them to, and this is just what's happened to date. This is the organization that can discuss this, but to submit a single comment with multiple signatures, right? It's still, in general, the system accommodates each part of a mass commenting campaign submitted as a single comment, but we know a lot more and have a lot more protections around that. And also within that, last thing I'll mention is that that actually one of the issues that's come up is whether kind of these are pseudo denial of service attacks. And so maybe a little bit more in the background, but the system also allows, and Virginia can talk about this if people are interested, like you do have a lot more control over the flow and can turn off an individual commenter if they get a little out of control or throttle back the rate. So a lot of the things that kind of we talked about 2 years ago, at least we tried to, I'll leave it to this group to see whether we did a good job, but at least we tried to accommodate some of those basics. So that's it.
Dom, would it be responsive to what you're saying to think about rephrasing to be a little bit more generic, such as ask people and entities orchestrating mass comment campaigns to, contact the agency in advance for procedures, or, to go through an API or something like that?
Again, that's, to me, that gets into the recommendations of this committee, and
Sure.
and since OB is as much a recipient of those recommendations, I don't want to get too much into the details. I would just suggest that there is I would suggest that the drafters and the committee look at this issue and see if you would perform an opinion about, oh, this actually does provide some good controls. I think it does, but that's really, for the committee to vote on. But to have this recommendation be reflective of the latest controls, if that makes sense, right? In that, right now, an organization that wants to submit bulk comments, it's, they either go through the API that they want individualized, but I guess they can individually put it as an attachment or something. We actually this is just me talking now. Like, I'm not a big fan of the bulk attachments because it's a little bit harder for the agencies to analyze if it's in one single PDF. But there's nothing preventing bulk commenters from using attachments or multiple signatures now. It's just we hope we provided a good, when I say we, the e-rulemaking in the interagency community. And it seems like for the most part, and I'll defer to Virginia, a lot of the industrial, stakeholder groups on all sides of the issues and commenters have actually used this API. It seems effective. And so, I would also suggest that maybe some of those that have used it on this are part of ACUS as well, can comment on that. But I'd just say make the recommendation reflective of maybe the tools that are in place now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Don. Noelle, you are next.
Thank you. So I wanted to also echo a couple of the concerns that I'm hearing regarding at least appearing to or suggesting that we're trying to limit, the public's ability to comment. With the mass campaigns, I will say that something that EPA does is we already do 2A. So we post a representative example, but then we still count each individual comment in the overall comment count. That's just a tally that's kept by the regs.gov folks. And the reason for that is because, the APA does require us to consider all, comments submitted by interested persons, and, sort of who is interested and who is not is sort of a call that we're not prepared to make. And so, I'm wondering if for some folks, signing up for these mass campaigns is the only way for them to engage, right, with the agencies and things like that. And we don't want to appear to not be sensitive to that possibility. And so I'm not saying that it does appear that way, but I want to caution folks against that. And so I would suggest for number 2, if possible, I think it's a good point that this recommendation makes to say that, in sentence 2 on number 2, these policies should balance concerns, including XYZ. I don't know how we could wordsmith it, but maybe include something about, retaining or maintaining the meaningfulness of the public comment experience or something like that. or something that encourages agencies to consider all these things, but also your obligations, right, under the APA, to give a fulsome sort of opportunity for the public to participate and to consider all relevant information, which could be in the form of identical comments, right, or not. So just a thought.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very helpful. Levon?
Yeah, hi. I'm from the Department of Education. I just wanted to sort of echo what Virginia said about 2D. I do think it would be more appropriate to move that to recommendation 1 or somewhere else, just because the ability to search the comments isn't really something that agencies control directly. That's really something that's done through the e-rulemaking program and you know how they structure regulations.gov and whatnot.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments on the current draft of recommendation 2 and any of the comments so far that have been made on it? Lon?
I think I'm getting confused here. Is A, B, and D are asking agencies to do things, right? And
Those
C
are
is,
those are options that agencies, as I read it, could include in their policies.
But
what
in
they're
their-
asking or channeling the public to do, right?
well, that's my, I guess that's my question. So each one is asking the public to do something? So in
Well,
other
those
words,
are
they're asking,
options that could be part of an agency policy.
again, a policy of asking the public to, for instance, break out and post non-identical content?
That's what 2B seems to, that's how I read 2B, yes.
Okay, well, that's what, okay, if that's what it means,
Or it could be that that it is that the agency's policy that this is what the agency will do when they're confronted with duplicate comments. So the agency in 2A will post a single representative example. The agency in 2B maybe breaking out and posting non-identical content. But then 2C is, well, it's still the agency, but the agency asking people to do something. And then 2D would be the agency providing enhanced search options.
I guess maybe I would suggest that we make that a little clearer, that A is the agency doing something, B is either one doing something, and because C says it's the agency asking people. We should
right
at least make it parallel to that. Explain who's supposed to be doing this. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other comments? And again, these are, I don't necessarily want anybody to think these are the final wordings, or, but if this is helpful to kind of go through this and elicit reactions. Anything else on 2?
Carrie, can I just, can I clarify some of the proposed language really quickly?
Well, I think the agencies for 2A could be including the option for agencies. I would say including the option, actually go back to what 2A was before post, but then before the colon, including the option for the agency. Look above, no, look above 2A, right before 2A line. I can't see what the line number is there, but where right before the colon, where it says including the option 2 colon. So you could, including the option for the agency to, okay, I think that might, and you could eliminate the duplication of the 2, including the option, because that's already preceding the colon. There we go. All right. Any other comments on 2 right now?
This is Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
At risk of getting into the agency policy space, just my observation is that a lot of these kinds of things are really on a case-by-case basis for the agency. I mean, I think a lot of times there's a desire maybe to publish more, but given the volume, you know, it's not like I can just say I'm going to put, you know what I mean? It's very case by case, given the
Yeah.
time, the resources and all that. So I just an observation that is agencies, assuming agencies did prepare their policies, it's not going to be, probably not going to be cut and dry where we're always going to just do a single representative sample or, you know what I mean? So just to keep in mind that the outcome of this may not be as clear cut as you might imagine. It might be a very sort of loose framework because so much of this might be dependent on resource constraints. Again, it's that balancing act, right? We
Or
want to do
what
more,
technology is available
or the
at a given
technology is
time.
available, or there's a time constraint, there's a rule with the deadline. Again, it's very case by case. I do know when I've spoken with agencies, they're always, well, I can never say always, right? But there's a general interest in, you know, having disclosure, but there's always a lot of constraints going on.
Okay, that's a good point. And maybe, Danny, let me suggest some language, at least to put in as a placeholder. On line 62, the sentence begins, "The agent should publish," and then after the word publish, insert a comma. Whether on a rule by rule basis or for rulemaking across the board. Comma. And I'm not sure that that's the most elegant, but it would leave an agency might want to say across the board, this is our standard practice for dealing with mass comments that are identical. And it sounds like, you know, that might be what characterizes, for example, EPA's current practice. But there might be other agencies, or even in EPA's case, where, you know, they might have some exceptional rulemaking where they want to announce some kind of different policy if they are anticipating a large number of comments. Does that seem to reflect
Well,
what you
I'm
were getting
worried.
at, Virginia?
Okay, I just hope it's not interpreted as being more restrictive. You know, again, I think rulemaking across the board, I doubt any agency is going to sign up for that because again, it's too restrictive for them. And so then when you read it as, okay, so then they're going to have to establish on a rule by rule basis, then they might read that to mean that for every single rule, I have to establish my policy of how I'm going to do the comments. And I think that's
Sure.
going to be excessively
Right.
burdensome. So I'm afraid that the addition of the wording creates more work for the agencies.
Well, maybe they need it, maybe for whether for targeted rules or
perhaps just leave the language as is and
okay, all right.
let it be general and let the agencies, I mean, their policy might say, for example, our policy is to look at rules on a case-by-case basis to determine the appropriate level of comments that should be looked at as a representative example, you know, blah, 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 towards the goal of, you know, maximizing publication of comments balanced against the resource constraints we face, period, end of policy. I'm just saying.
Right. Well, I think you're right. And maybe what you could do, Danny, would be cut and copy what I suggested there and just stick it into a comment. My only reason for suggesting that is I think a reasonable inference of a recommendation to publish policies almost suggests that these should be invariant across rules. That this is that's what a policy
And that's my
is,
concern, is because I
right.
don't think that
Right.
that inflexibility,
No,
I'm not sure that's going to be workable. Again, they have
Right.
so many smaller rulemakings where they frankly are like, well, we'll just publish all 10 comments. We don't care because
Right.
there's only 10,
right.
right? And then where do you draw the line? Okay, well, if it's 1 million comments, then there's more of a sample. Well, what if it's 150? I mean, where do you draw the line? And again, it's a lot of it is subject to the number of rulemakings they're facing, the timing of the rulemakings, the content of the comments themselves. I mean, who determines how similar is similar in terms
Right.
of getting the representative sample? It's really going to be, I think agencies need the maximum flexibility. If they're going to do a policy, the policy is going to have to be very flexible. I think having some formula is simply not going to be workable.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was trying to sort of get at, that this could be adjusted, but it may be, I also am hearing you say, or at least I'm thinking in my own mind based upon what you're saying, that it could be that there, and I open this up for discussion, could be that there isn't really a forward-looking policy that needs to be adopted, but agencies should provide a clear statement of how they have addressed this in any particular rulemaking. Either now, that could be, so in this rulemaking, we didn't know we were going to get 1 million comments, but now that we have them, this is how they're sorted, and this is how they're made available to you, and that could be different than a policy that was announced ex ante, but it's a statement made ex post about how the agency has processed and made those duplicate comments avaviable.
But then that's for every rulemaking. That again,
No,
that seems
no,
sort of
no,
burdensome.
Well, that's yeah. And that could be, again, with the proviso that these are recommendations when agencies are confronted with mass comment campaigns or computer generated or malattributed comments.
I'll make one final suggestion. Sometimes in these environments, it's, again, maybe useful to focus on the outcome as opposed to like the method, like a policy.
Right.
And just say,
right.
look, we recommend that agencies support transparency in the way they account for their comments.
Right.
And let them figure out how to do that. I mean, maybe it's in the preamble of the rule, right? Because they do that already, that says we got 1 million comments and, we did this and that. We posted a sample of this here, and just leave it to them to figure out how to implement it, but focus on the outcome, transparency and accountability, and representation, and leave it to them how to interpret it. And that's my final 2 cents, because I don't want to get into ACUS business too much.
No, that's very helpful, Virginia. Much appreciated. And it looked like it has prompted Bridget Dooling to share a comment. So that's another indication of what a valuable comment it is, if it prompted some further conversation from Bridget. You're next.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's a great conversation so far. Thanks, Carrie, for your leadership on this committee. So I was one of the consultants, and I just wanted to raise the trade-off, which is that the more idiosyncratic it is in how the agency's treatment of these comments gets expressed, meaning in the preamble of the rule sometimes, or maybe in a blanket policy, the harder it will be to take a big step back and observe at a system level, or even at an agency level, how agencies are handling these comments. So I definitely hear, and the need for flexibility resonates with me, just in light of my own experience. What you lose in not having, a forward-looking policy that really strives to say, when we get comments of this type, here's how we'll treat them, and then reflect it, and then carry, not just having the policy, but actually carrying it through in the docket management, is that it's much, much harder to actually to appreciate, what is going on in those agency dockets as a whole. And I think because this phenomenon is so it's so present in our rulemaking system, that building ways to characterize these comments that will allow us to take a step back and observe those system level or even agency level approaches has value. But of course, that is in tension with, all the things that you all have already been discussing. I just wanted to explain what's kind of on the other side of the ledger there.
Right. I think that's well stated. And, again, part of maybe the struggle with how these are maybe phrased is that you might have agencies that with some regularity are dealing with rules that are generating mass comments, and maybe a policy might make more sense for that agency. But some other agencies might be surprised, and not and just happen to have it. And did they need to develop this policy for something that's a relatively low probability event for them? I don't know what the answer is. And maybe it's not even a big concern. Just trying to raise that, as I think it's consistent with the kinds of concerns that Virginia is raising for us as well. Okay, Levon, I think, is your hand raised? Is that a leftover from before?
Yeah, I think that's leftover.
Okay. Any other comments that anyone wants to make on recommendation, or draft recommendation 2? I think, what we can do from this conversation, by the way, that we're having, just to let everybody know, often what ACUS staff can do then, and I will be happy to work with them certainly on this, is try to take the kinds of concerns that are reflected in our discussion today and come back with a revised draft that would be open for further comment and revision by the committee. But to keep us moving along,
Harry, can I just make one very brief comment apropos of what you just said? We certainly invite and benefit very much from the submission of written comments through our website, or they can be submitted directly to Danny. And given the very large number of people participating here, the submission of written comments on a large point or a discrete point could be very useful, especially as the staff drafts the recommendation.
Absolutely. It's not a plebiscite, remember, but no, just in all seriousness, it is not only ironic, but it's fitting, actually, that we encourage comments on this drafting process. All right, with that, I think before we turn to recommendation 3, I'd like to suggest that we take a bit of a break. We've been almost at it for 2 hours. So if we could come back in about, let's see, it's now 4 minutes before noon. I have so 12:05 reconvene, and then we'll start with a discussion of recommendation 3. So feel free to use this as an opportunity to stretch your legs. Can reconvene. All right, I hope we're back and ready to go. I'd like to turn to the draft recommendation number 3 and see if anyone has any reactions or comments or suggestions based upon that draft. It reads currently that agencies, both those that use regulations.gov and those that do not, should consider using identity validation or other similar identity proofing tools in their comment submission processes. So this, I think, is, correct me if I'm mistaken, but this could be thought of as the CAPTCHA draft recommendation. Virginia, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this gets into what Dominic was mentioning before. I'm not sure if everyone knows, but in February, when we cut over to a newer version of regulations.gov, it had been in the beta testing format for a while. We were able to fully implement reCAPTCHA, which means only, the real people can get in, the buses and the stoplights, along with a comment API. And I should add that it enables only legit users of bulk comments into the system. I should add that we had a reCAPTCHA on the beta version going back to last summer. But the legacy regulations.gov was still up. So we had 2 systems. So reCAPTCHA was just on the one. But when we cut over in February, we were able to take away the back door, if you will. And so the legacy system is now gone. And so just to recap what Dominic said, it's 2 tracks, right? reCAPTCHA is just for the real people. The API is because there are some, sometimes I call them good bots or bad bots, or, there's legit actors and then there's some bad actors in the bulk comment area. So by setting up this comment API, we also, have a key process. So you have to apply for the key. And then we use a third-party validation service. It doesn't matter who it is. There's many, but it's LexisNexis. And so they go in and make sure that entity is who they say they are. And we also require that entity to complete a certification to us that says they will not, steal people's data or make up comments by themselves, right? They'll, to the best of their knowledge, only use real comments from real people. And then once all of that's taken place, the certification and the entity validation, then they have access to our system. And we've gotten great feedback from several industry providers because it's now a more stable and secure way to upload the comments. And I will say it's been better for our program overall, because when it used to be sort of wide open, these bulk comments used to come in and sometimes it would threaten to crash our system because of the huge volume, and we'd have to throttle the system. And now we can manage the intake process, throttle it properly, adjust as needed. And it's been a much more secure environment. And we've really had great feedback from industry. Now, I will add that, nothing is completely leak proof. This is sort of a funny story. We did get a call in the help desk in the first few weeks. Some individual called in and he said, I've been typing in comments all day and this reCAPTCHA tool keeps blocking me. I got in like the first 2 times, but I have another 50 comments I want to enter. It's like, well, that's why reCAPTCHA stopped you. You're not supposed to do that, right? So that being said, if a person, I know. Anyway, if a person really wanted to, they could type in a comment Monday and then another comment the following week and, in someone else's identity, but, it really slows people down, right? It's really slowing people down to have this reCAPTCHA in place. And then use of the comment API, again, they have to be approved. And so we've got a bunch of people using it, and, we're open to more applicants. And, again, we've got all these extra protections in place to ensure that they're, hopefully the good guys. If for some reason we suspect, again, we can track a comment to the source, to that API source, and explore. But at the end of the day, we have total discretion to cut off an API user it's up to us. You know, we get to cut them off. They don't have to, there's no burden of evidence. We've talked with our attorneys. If somebody's misbehaving badly, or we see that there's a perception, we don't need to go to court or, you know, anything. We can just make that decision. But hopefully that won't happen. And I don't think we've seen anything like that yet, but you know, the world changes, we'll see.
Okay.
So that's kind of the situation we have right now. I should add, the other thing we did is we have terms and conditions on the website stating that, you know, it is a violation of federal law to falsify your identity or someone else's identity, right, in use of this system. You know, it's a warning. You know, enforcement of that, of course, is up to agencies. And the API entities also have to show those same terms and conditions to their users as they come in and use that resource, so that everybody's warned. Don't be a fake commenter, I guess.
Well, this
So
is,
I think that's a lot, but it's, again, you know, somebody could still, you know, figure out a way. Anyway, that's what I wanted to make you aware of.
well, thank you very much, Virginia. I mean, that suggests for this draft comment, to me at least, that maybe, you know, the wording needs maybe not to include those that use regulations.gov if regulations.gov already has reCAPTCHA. At least that's a question. And then I think there's some later draft recommendations that might also in some sense already be in effect for regulations.gov, based upon what you've just said. So thank you. Next, I've got a queue here building. Rebecca, and then it'll be Noel, and then Dom.
Thank you. I have a couple line edits to suggest on 73 and 74. And the reason I'd like to suggest them is I know this is about CAPTCHA because I read the preamble and the accompanying report, but I have concerns about some of our operational folks who are only reading the recommendations, however they get implemented, not realizing that, because identity proofing means other things in our security context. I don't want them calling commenters, emailing commenters to try and ascertain that they are who they say they are. So I would suggest in line 73, after the word agencies, I would suggest inserting that operate commenting platforms. And then after, it's moved now, but after identity validation, I would insert the word technology. And that would address my concerns about people trying to manually quiz people about who they are.
And keep other similar identity proofing tools?
I'm indifferent on that. I'm not sure what else it adds, but it doesn't bother me.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Noel.
Yeah, so Rebecca actually touched on exactly what my question / concern was, and also answered my question, and so did Virginia, so thanks for that. So this does refer to CAPTCHA in that by identity violation, we're referring to technology that makes sure you're not a robot versus technology that requires you to identify yourself, as in like, my name is Jane Doe.
Right. So, yeah, or maybe, well, this gets to whether, right. So do you allow anonymous comments? Is that what you want? Is that what you're kind of getting at, Noel? Whether you need to actually declare your identity and then confirm who you actually are, rather than just confirm that you're not, it'd be almost human validation technology more than identity validation. Is that?
So that's what I'm getting at, Carrie. Because and just speaking for myself, I have some concerns about asking, or about at least requiring folks to identify themselves before submitting a comment. I see why that would be, beneficial. Because at least then we could sort of take care of the malappropriated comments concerns. But I do believe, and don't quote me on this, but I do believe that my agency allows anonymous comments in the sense that when folks submit their comment, like their name is not a required field. I believe that's how that goes. Again, don't
Right.
quote me. And the reason for that is, of course, like we don't want to, put any constraints on people's ability to submit comments to a docket. So that's exactly what I'm getting at, Carrie. I'm wondering if you're saying like agencies should basically only allow people that identify themselves to submit comments. And I have concerns about that.
I was going to actually turn to our consultants to see if they have some have considered this distinctions, and Bridget has indicated she has a suggestion. So Bridget.
Yeah, thanks. I think so. This caught my eye too. I don't think that we had a recommendation like this in our report, and I agree that the wording could mislead, that this is about people proving who they are in the course of submitting a comment. And I don't think that, if I'm understanding the discussion, I don't think that's the goal here. So one way to handle it would be at a minimum in the preamble, distinguishing this type of validation. And you just do describe in the preamble what this type of validation is, that it's about establishing that this is a human, not a computer submitting something. I think it would be helpful if you added an express distinction to say this is distinct from identity validation in the sense of authentication, or authenticating that the person is who they say they are. Because I think that, and we do get into this a bit in our report, that any front end effort to ask people to prove how they are on the front end really does raise the barrier to commenting in a potentially very significant way.
Okay, thank you. And Philip, you also wanted to weigh in specifically on this point.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Yeah, I guess this might not be entirely applicable here, but one thing that I think we need to consider is when you have folks who potentially are employees or work with or are business partners of firms that are that face potential regulation or have interest in rulemaking proceedings. You worry about folks who, if they have to disclose their identity, they decide not to comment for fear of retribution or for fear of reprisals on their business interests. So I do think you need some sort of process that enables folks who might be whistleblowers or whose livelihoods are essentially on the line if they decide to provide feedback in the rulemaking process, to do so without putting them at risk. That might not be here on sort of the identity validation front end, but I think it is something to consider as far as how an agency is internally tracking and keeping track of who has commented, and also as they publicly identify who has commented in proceedings on the back end, that with that information being publicly available.
The good point, and another reason it seems to me to clarify that this, if this is intended really for the problem of computer generated comments, that it's validating that it's a human, not a bot that's generated the comment. I would also note that your comment, Philip, highlighted for me the possibility that if agencies do not allow anonymous comments, they may well be contributing to the malattributed comments problem. Because if I have to identify myself as someone, maybe I will make up a name or refer to somebody else. That's a possibility. I have Dom and Michael in the raised hand queues. Michael, you just entered in. Were you trying to jump in on this very point?
I was, since you.
Okay, then let Dom, if you're okay being, I will get to you after we finish this thread here.
Just really quickly, because you asked, what the hell the consultants were thinking about. At present, some agencies allow anonymous comments, some don't. I think that either approach is legal. Our assumption was that either approach was legal. We very much were not trying to take any position on that issue, either legal from a legal or policy point of view. And it's a course that ACUS has been around before and gave serious consideration. And the recommendation that resulted was it's up to the agency, and the agency should clearly state its policy. And we certainly had no intent to revisit that.
Okay, thank you. Another reason that we will clarify that is human validation, if you will. Great, thank you, everyone. Dom, now thank you for your patience. You may need to unmute your mic.
Oh, I think I triple muted myself. Here we go. Okay, let me try to. And I agree. I actually, at the course of this conversation, I like put my hand down, like, okay, they're making all the points. And then they kept talking, and like, oh wait, there's more points to make. So that's the nature of these. So thanks, Gary, for facilitating that. I want to explain a little bit how we arrived at the place that we did, because I think it informs this conversation with respect to e-rulemaking. And as you know, like I've been a little bit on the hook for this issue. My one time having to testify as acting administrator of OIRA was on this issue in the Senate. So and so I wanted to say that this was an incredibly carefully balanced policy that we came up with respect to e-rulemaking. And so nothing about where we landed was random. And here's where we landed. And I think Virginia explained it extremely well, but I wanted to be perfectly clear here. Like, we landed in the policy that, okay, individuals do not have to identify themselves. They are entitled to, but they don't have to. What they do is they have to prove that they're human. And as Virginia said at the end, I mean, it's in a link, but yeah, it's the equivalent of the strongly worded DOJ letter about like, behave yourselves. You know, don't use someone else's. I actually think it's, you know, we tested that because we thought that language itself may actually be a little bit of a coolant to providing comment, but it's there, and I actually think it's pretty powerful. If I were doing that, I'd hesitate before doing something nefarious in the commenting process after reading that language from DOJ. Okay, but since it's still anonymous, you know, but you have to be human, and let's talk about whether you can get around reCAPTCHA. This is about what the general strategies are. Okay, but, and this was like something we had to really talk to the agencies about, like making calls, having lots of meetings about, like, we are not allowing anonymized bulk commenting, right? You can do it through reCAPTCHA, I guess, you know, if you're really a sophisticated, nefarious user, but the bulk commenting API is only available to organizations that validate themselves. And that is a big change in my head, philosophically, from where we were before, which was like, you know, let a thousand flowers bloom. Now, yes, you can still individually submit an attachment if you really wanted to. And so it's not like a prevention, there's ways of doing it, but what we wanted to do was like kind of the way that e-rulemaking and would like to receive bulk comments and preserve a lot of the functionality is for stakeholders that are validated. And again, that was a big change. And so I just wanted to clarify the route that we took to come up with the policies that we did, that was very deliberate. So I don't know if this helps focus this discussion, but you know, I agree with all the points. We would like, I could never imagine as a policy the government not accepting anonymized comments in e-rulemaking. I would never support that personally. So maybe to wait for me to leave if that happens. But in general, like I said, the individuals, the agencies, kind of thing that we leave to the agencies. But in any stretch of the imagination, I think that in rulemakings that have mass comment campaigns, we're going to know a lot more about where they're coming from. And if that was the choice that we made, I think it's a good thing.
Dom, thank you. That's very informative. Can I just follow up with one quick question of clarification? So the organization needs to identify itself and validate its identity to have the bulk commenting capacity. But then those individuals that are part of their bulk comment dump, if you will, or submission, they could be anonymous, couldn't they?
I believe they could
I mean, they'll be
be.
identified with that organization, but they don't have to know it's, you know, Joe Smith with the validated organization, do they?
That's a good question. I actually haven't, like, that's why you're good at this, Carrie. I didn't really contemplate the situation in which, like, an organization would want to say they're bulk commenting, but not kind of have kind of a name of the commenters, right? Because that's part of the goal, is to say, like, you know, this is on behalf of my constituents.
Okay.
As Virginia said, they do have to abide and certify that they're abiding by the same limitations, like that they're using real people. But I guess I don't think there'd be anything, unless Virginia says something differently, or the tech folks,
okay,
anything preventing them from providing anonymous bulk comments as long as they're certified. And if there is, it's more of a technical point of view. I don't think we really contemplated that scenario all that much.
Yeah,
Virginia's, go ahead, Virginia.
Just to augment what Dom said, and he's completely right. I think, you know, these entities have to certify, you know, we're not making up the comments ourselves, and we're only collecting them from real people. And so when they collect them from real people, they'd have to have their names, because if they were anonymous, they wouldn't know they're real. I mean, the way a lot of these do this is there's like links on Facebook. I mean, maybe you guys have seen this, or Twitter, or, you know, anywhere.
Right.
And it's something like, hey, you know, do you want to save the whales, or, you know, whatever it is, click here, you know, and then so your identity gets imported. So, I mean, I could explore, we could easily, but I don't think there's really any imagined scenario where, while it's not legally prohibited, I don't envision a scenario where anonymous comments would come into that. Again, typically it's membership organizations. You know, again, I'll just pick, you know, I actually don't even think they use our API, but, you know, maybe the Sierra Club or some group. To be honest, it's actually mostly marketing companies that work for associations, right? PopVox and Politico and groups like that. And they represent different entities. They, you know, they offer this service. But again, it's typically, you know, some organization that's going to say, you know, of our members, they all really are in favor of this rule. And so, and then it's managed, you know, with that identity. So you know, we could take a look, but I don't really imagine that ever being a scenario.
I could imagine, for example, to go back to Philip's point, you know, a labor union wanting to create a tool like this and encourage employees to comment on a rule, but want to protect those employees, you know, in their workplace from any, you know, reprisals from commenting. Perhaps just speculating there, but that seems a possible instance where you could know that they're coming from the labor union and labor union members. They're real people. You know, you have a recapture on it, but you're not forcing the union members to disclose their identities. Might be worth.
But if I may, in that scenario, I think it's more likely the labor union would send a single letter, right, saying representing our 10,000 members, this is our position. You know what I mean? You know, to go the other way is extremely onerous and probably not as effective. So you're right.
But you know, I don't know if it's for ACUS or the government to determine how people want to represent their interests. You know that. Anyway,
no, it's not for us to determine. I'm just saying probability wise. And then there's still this recapture, which is anonymous. So they can always go that way.
Okay. Any other comments on draft number 3?
Yes, this is Noelle. Thanks again. This has actually been a really helpful discussion for me.
So I'm still sort of hung up, for lack of a better term, on the phrase identity validation technology or other similar identity proofing tools. So as like a non-tech person, without hearing this helpful sort of context, I don't read that and immediately think, oh, they're talking about reCAPTCHA. You know, I think I read that and I see identity validation and I'm like, oh, they're gonna make me identify myself.
Right. Right.
I'm Noel.
I think we definitely should reword that, and we can certainly suggest something now. I mean, should consider using technology that you know, verifies a commenter is a human being, or something along those lines. And you could even put perhaps, you know, comma, such as reCAPTCHA, which is being used by the, you know, if you really wanted to make that clear, but you know, and we could even say there or other similar tools.
May I offer a clarifying observation?
Go ahead.
Just the way I read this, I don't know if others read it this way, but it says agencies that operate commenting platforms. I'm assuming this is referring to the FCC or the SEC.
Right.
Because like e-rulemaking runs the commenting platform, not the agencies. So just to clarify, this is referring to independent agencies.
Right. Right. Because you already are using this, so I don't, you know, if an agency were to leave your system, to the extent that that's permitted, I suppose then this recommendation would apply to them. Right. Okay, anything else on, Noel, does that help clarify what you were getting? We may well be able to you know, wordsmith that a little bit more elegantly or some such, but that would be the idea.
Yes, this helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay. If there's nothing else on number 3, then let's move to number 4. Draft number 4 is about agencies and relevant coordinating bodies, which could include the rulemaking program, OIRA, or any governmental bodies or informal working groups formed by agencies that address common rulemaking issues, should encourage the development of technology for identifying malattributed and computer-generated comments in the docket. So any reactions or responses to that? Virginia?
I hesitate to be the one doing all the talking. So if others,
I didn't see any other hands on, so yes, but go ahead.
All right. I just wanted to mention, let's see, there's 2 things here. Encourage the development of technology for identifying malattributed comments in the docket. And then it also says, and computer generated. So are you talking about both of those at the same time or 2 separate things? Because, for example, we already have the ability to identify now computer generated documents, at least in regulations.gov through the API, right? So is the limit, are you only talking about malattributed mass comments?
You have the ability,
you know, is
to
it just
tell,
the one thing malattributed?
If I create a software program, you'll be able to automatically generate a comment. You can tell that it was created by my software program versus me.
You have to use the API in order to submit bulk comments. So computer generated comments, those relate that you'd have to use our API. The reCAPTCHA will defeat you otherwise. So the only way you can get in is through the API, and we have to validate you.
Right. Okay. You're
So I
not
think what
really
you're asking is
identifying
just
the generation, but you are addressing the possibility that somebody could automate a process that both automatically generates a comment and automatically submits it. You're really getting at it through the submission. That's the and
Right.
you know, and that may be sufficient. I mean, it's not clear. You know, this is an interesting recommendation, draft recommendation in my mind, because it's not clear what it means to encourage the development of this technology.
Yeah. You know, it gets back to, I mean, for me, this is a little tricky because we've already talked about the ability for anonymous comments to exist. And you know, and again, you know, when speaking to agencies, and again, you know, I don't want to fully represent all the agencies, but things I've heard are things like, you know, even if it's fake, you know, if it has a good comment, we'll still listen to it because it's the substance that matters under the Administrative Procedure Act, you know, substantial evidence. Now, again, I know different legal minds, you know, and I know this is a room full of attorneys may have an opinion on that, but some of the folks I've talked to have said, look, you know, even if it's from Elvis Presley or, you know, Benjamin Franklin, you know, we're like, gosh, they made a really good point. We wouldn't dismiss it. And the process for them to dismiss it involves a pretty enormous forensic analysis that could take a year or more in order to exclude it from the docket and to formally. And so in their minds, what they probably do is they just go, oh, right, bing, I'm going to put it in that pile. Useful, don't know who it is, but I'm still going to focus on the intent and objectives of my rulemaking. And so the process of agencies have actually, so what we've done, as I mentioned previously, is we've hopefully, you know, closed down 99.99% of the spigot of malattributed comments, right? Is what we hope. I mean, and so maybe again, there's some person who's going into reCAPTCHA. It's a human, right? But he or she is typing in a new comment every 2 weeks under a different name, you know, so those slip through. And so then the question is, how much resources should we spend on tracking those down? You know, particularly when we talk about it not being a plebiscite, right? And the focus is on sentiment. So I think this is where there's a huge sort of trade-off cost benefit on tracking down those malattributed comments. We already know who the we now know who the mass commenters are who are generating comments through bots. And we know, because we've had to verify them, that it's like PopVox, Bloomberg. I'll tell you, any of the names that have come up are all readily recognizable names. I mean, the point may come when, you know, some unknown entity, you know, I mean, we go through the identity validation, but, you know, Bloomberg, PopVox, it's kind of a, you know, a top 10 list. So again, focus on identifying malattributed comments. And then my final point is, you know, I'm sure everyone's read the literature about deep fakes and how difficult it is to discern a computer generated comment from a real one. And so again, the level of effort that it would take to actually prove forensically that a comment is fake is enormous. And then if you ask yourself, well, if I actually am saying I have to exclude it prior to issuing my rule, that will delay the rule. If I have to track it down and I say, well, forget the rule, I'll just work on my rule and pursue this in the background, then what's the point? You know what I mean? It's like the forensics and the legal action to pursue this are quite enormous. And again, the limited possibility of it is also a consideration. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Virginia. Dom, you're in the queue.
Sure, I had more of a question. That was the committee or the consultants thinking about that deep fake issue. And kind of what I guess the short recommendation is like, actually, you know, I've always considered this an arms race, and, you know, have the consultants or the committee thought about like, okay, given the current system, what are the remaining vulnerabilities? And, you know, when Virginia mentioned deep fakes, I agree. Like, I don't know if there's a piece of technology that could develop deep fakes and take the, you know, and defeat reCAPTCHA and start to, you know, start to really gum up the system again. So that's what I would be interested in. And but I'm not quite at the edge of understanding of what the vulnerabilities are. And one other thought was that, you know, I think it was the Harvard work about this, and you know, that was one of the issues that we saw, and you know, they kind of generated fake email addresses in order to diversify the the computer generated comments. And so we thought it, like, the system was responsive to that a little bit, but I'll stop there. Just like, I'm interested in, like, okay, we have a place, but you know, can the Russians, like, you know, get around it? And also, is it worth it? I mean, I don't, you know, it's, you know, part of this is just raising the cost, and, you know,
Right.
but the next big EPA rule, are our tools going to break down? I don't know what if this recommendation was developed in the context of what might be coming in the future, right?
Well, and that's a good point. And I want to maybe take that last point about what's coming in the future and just highlight what are really, I think, very close similarities between this draft recommendation 4 and draft recommendation 5, which, as I read it, and you know, correct me if you see otherwise, draft 4 is saying agencies should encourage the technology for identifying these, and 5 is saying should stay abreast of developments so that you can respond to them. This suggests they could be either combined, or query whether they are, you know, yeah, I don't know whether they certainly might be combined in that regard. And I do note that there's nothing quite identical, I think, and maybe the consultants can correct me on this too, but I don't see anything quite identical to 4 in the report. It's more of a stay abreast and, you know, be open to new technologies. So maybe that's a possible strategy. I certainly invite reactions on that if anybody has them. Lon, you are next in the queue.
I have a question. If 3 is asking agencies to use identifying technology, what is 4 asking you to do? Encourage the development of it?
I think it's actually, I read it as technology that would actually identify a particular comment as malattributed, or identify a comment as computer generated, which Virginia's response, if I heard her correctly, is, well, we don't really need that once you have an effective tool for keeping people from submitting computer generated comments. We don't, you know,
Is that what
maybe,
is that what
yeah.
is that what number 3 is doing? So that's
Yeah,
not
number
so
3
different.
would be reducing that possibility, because you're worried, I think, with the computer generated comments, that somebody will create a software program that automatically creates comments and then automatically submits them. And if you stop them at the submissions point, which is what 3 is intended to do, then you've addressed the problem by and large. If I'm understanding that correctly, Virginia, is that, go ahead.
Yeah, let me parse it out a little bit. The way I see it, there's actually three issues at least here that are kind of being commingled. One, it's malattributed, meaning it's the person isn't the right person, right? It's Elvis Presley or some other person's fake identity. Number two, it talks about computer generated, and computer generated has two components. There's the computer that generates this fake content, the deep fake, right? And they take a basic thing and they keep switching the words around slightly to basically make it look like they're slightly different. And then there's a third one, which is using bots to send it, right? That's using the bot to basically send number one and number two to the system.
Right.
And so, when we looked at the problem, you see these phases, right?
Right.
I'm sorry, but Carrie, isn't number 3 addressing all of those 3?
Not really. It's number 3 is, as I see it, is addressing the second and third of what Virginia is saying, because the third is a computer automatically submitting what could be identical comments, but number 2 is the computer generating some kind of distinctive comments, but then also submitting them. And I think that would, the second and third categories would be caught by that. But if a human wanted to identify, if I wanted to submit something under Lon Smith's name, that's a malattributed comment.
There's no,
but
reCAPTCHA that's the malattributed.
Right. reCAPTCHA would
you
not.
can write in Mickey Mouse, but this is where that doesn't happen a lot. Agencies are like Mickey Mouse, whatever. It doesn't necessarily, so that is an issue, but it's not necessarily the big issue. So the approach GSA took through e-rulemaking was, again, looking at this. There's maybe people made up names, and a lot of times, predominantly, those are associated with those mass automated comments, right? That's what the study showed.
That's not part, I'm sorry.
It wasn't.
And that's not part of number 3?
Not really, because if I'm a human entering a comment and I type in Lon Smith as my name, I still will get the reCAPTCHA, identify all the school buses in this image, and I can click it and I'll submit it as Lon Smith. I think to actually distinguish a little bit further from what Virginia's saying with the malattributed comments, there's the malattributed that's kind of harmless with respect to me identifying myself as Mickey Mouse, but there's a malattributed comment where I put in my name is Lon Smith and I use Lon Smith's address, and it may cause some reputational or other harm perhaps to you, Lon. So I think that would be another way of breaking this down even further. Does that, Lon, but does this help clarify what you were asking about?
Yeah, I think so. I'll have to take a look at 3 and 4 again and see if it's clear enough for me. But I see what you're saying now. Thank you.
But I think part of the confusion, by the way, and the ambiguity here is the way 3 was originally worded. It sounded like it was identity validating and identity proofing that would, and I don't think there is an available technology out there that, other than, as Virginia was saying, to get the U.S. Department of Justice and FBI to investigate you, and that could take years.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
I just may add.
Yeah, go ahead, Virginia.
I just wanted to conclude my thought real quick, which was, so there were the 3 areas. And so when GSA looked at the problem, part of it was, well, you've already got these comments. Can you figure out which ones were fake? And again, the Harvard study, and any study, the Harvard study was done by an undergraduate, but anybody will tell you deep fakes are incredibly hard to discern. So the fact we thought is, look, we don't even want to, that's going to be too tricky. We need to nip this before we even get the comments, right? So this is where we, put more locks on the doors to the system. You either have to go through reCAPTCHA, which proves you're a real person, doesn't necessarily prove your identity, but anonymous comments are permitted. And we found, again, I should say, in doing the reading about all the cases with the FCC, the fake identities were really coming through bots primarily, right? They're computer generated. So the sense is the reCAPTCHA portal is probably lower risk, right? So then on the other hand, we've got the thing for the bulk comments, right? And that's going to be the API. And you have to be a legit user, and you have to prove that you are who you are, and you have to sign a certification. Now, could you still generate a bunch of fake comments and do deep fakes? You could, but you certified you wouldn't. There's a legal penalty. If we see, you know, if stuff starts coming in and it looks out of whack, again, we don't do this on our own, but if the agency brought it to our attention, because they're the one who read the comments, if they said there's something suspicious, you know, then we would do the follow-up. And there is a forensic tracking, right, to go back to the source of those comments so that we can, whatever, figure out what's going on or cut them off or refer it to the Department of Justice or whatever we need to do. So again, there's still a small chance that people, you could still have these malattributed comments, but you know, I mean, it's hard to make it, you know, steel, like a total steel trap.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, Dom, did you have I see your hand up. Did you want to jump back in?
Yeah, just very briefly, especially since Bridget has her hand up. And I just wanted to express support for some sort of combination of 5 and 4. And that's just for what it's worth. I do think that, as you've heard, like we may just not be creative enough, but you know, we felt like we thought really hard about some of these solutions. But I am actually, I'll say like 4 and 5 actually I thought were incredibly useful. I actually think this is important to just, the agencies need to keep thinking about the vulnerabilities of the system. And, you know, I can't tell you, I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but, you know, I'm sure someone who's determined with enough resources can still find some nefariousness to do. I just don't know what it looks like. And so, you know, I don't know if the consultants have more thoughts about that. I would really welcome that though, because you know, we know this is going to be an arms race. We think we're doing pretty well, but you know, the first time that there's a big rulemaking with millions of comments, what if the docket starts to look weird in ways that we didn't predict? And that's what I'm worried about. And so I would welcome, you know, any focus moving forward on this kind of the spirit of this conversation. It's just the details, of course, you know, everyone is still talking about. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Dom. And Bridget.
Yeah, and I'd encourage other consultants to speak to this point too. I mean, from my perspective, I think combining 4 and 5 makes a lot of sense. There was a question earlier about what encouraging the development of technology is really asking for. And I think one way to think about that is something like a challenge, recognizing that this, you know, the skills needed to even imagine what the vulnerabilities are may just exist outside of the type of people who gather around an ACUS table on a regular basis. And so one way to draw other communities in would be to, you know, do a challenge or some type of way to incentivize their engagement on a tricky problem. And I just want to echo what Dom said. I think we really understood and appreciate that you're never one and done with this. It's iterative. It's going to continue to evolve. And so at least from my perspective, at least part of what we're trying to do here is just encourage ongoing surveillance, because it's wonderful to hear that the GSA team it feels good about the current measures in place on the front end screening tool. But if you stop paying attention to what is showing up in the docket and don't develop tools to kind of, and I'm not suggesting that you are ignoring what's in there. I'm just saying you can't rely on those locks to be sufficient forever. And so if you have other methods to be keeping an eye on the dockets, particularly for deep fakes, recognizing that that's probably the hardest technical challenge to bite off, you know, that there's some ongoing need to just keep an eye on this, because that does seem like one of those edge case vulnerabilities that may not be present in our system so much right now, but may be the type of thing that jeopardizes the legitimacy of certain rulemakings down the road. And that's not at all to take away from robust set of changes that folks have made on a technical and a policy level to regulations.gov, and I'm sure it's excellent, and I'm sure there are plans to keep an eye on it. Our goal was just to reinforce that inclination to keep an ongoing surveillance and sort of engagement mindset with this problem, because we're just never going to be done with it.
Right. And as I heard Virginia say, may be helpful to have agencies who are reading the comments be able to be aware of this. And that's something that ACUS could certainly encourage with a combined 4 and 5. Virginia, last comment, because we're coming.
We're wrapping up
end.
on time. So yeah, I want to say thank you, Bridget, for those observations. And this is where, I want to emphasize, I feel like, we've got hopefully the fake comment issue more or less in a box. But what the remaining challenge is, and it is enormous, is still mass comments. Agencies still get huge volumes of comments that are legitimate. And it's a massive workload for them to work through those without a good deduplication tool. And in fact, given, the way things go, and if these APIs grow, we'll have even more comments. So this is where I think at least my goal, and again, in hopes that we'll be getting some modernization funding, is to begin exploring more advanced technologies, natural language processing, artificial intelligence, ontology, some of the things I mentioned earlier, that will not only help with processing mass comments, right, to discern meaning, sentiment, to track patterns. We could even, this is a whole other meeting, but how to explore what that could do in terms of finding trends in geography or any number of issues across regulatory domains, right? You can also use that. You could use that to potentially explore deep fakes as well. And then you can also use that to, again, support analyses across rulemakings and rulemaking domains, looking for opportunities to streamline or reduce duplication, or, to look at areas where there's maybe some contradiction or some synergies. And so I think that going forward is where our real focus is to do that. We're not forgetting about fake comments, but we're now, that's kind of a little piece. We're now focusing on the bigger picture of overall comment analysis, which will include a better ability to address poor content as well in meaning, and then also look at the entire rulemaking domain. All right, that's my pitch.
That's a great
That's
wrap
another
up.
study.
Thank you. And we have, only started through the list of draft recommendations that we have. We didn't get to obviously even half of them yet, but we will start right away next time with going through the remaining draft recommendations. In the meantime, between now and our next meeting, which will be Thursday, April 29th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern time. The details will be on the ACUS website for that April 29th meeting. Between that now and then, I would encourage anyone at this meeting who has comments to make on these 5 draft recommendations or anything else to send them into ACUS. And I think the sooner you can do that, the better, so that we can take that into account in revising these draft recommendations. And I know that there were many people on the call and the meeting today, and some of them were from the public, and we didn't get a chance to have time for your comments, but we do welcome them and urge you to submit them to ACUS. With that, I want to thank everybody for your thoughtful participation today. I thought the discussion was really informative. We started off with the big picture and the general problems, and we've moved along to some specific possible ACUS recommendations. I want to thank Danny on the ACUS staff for keeping our notes and tracking our changes along the way. I want to thank Mark and Reeve and others on ACUS staff for their efforts as well. And also most especially thank the consultants for the tremendous work that they've done on their report and helping inform our discussions here today. So with that, we will conclude for today. I wish everybody a good rest of the day and a nice weekend. and we will see you again on April 29th.
Thank you, everyone.